Welcome to the Global from Asia podcast, where the daunting process of running an international business from Hong Kong is broken down into straight-up, actionable advice. And now, your host, Michael Michelini.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to another episode of Global from Asia. We're at episode 21 and mid-February here. Valentine's Day is just passed in 2014. We are on the road still on this socialagent.me road trip, and I've finally convinced my good friend Attila that's on the trip with us to spill his guts a bit on his business dealings in Hong Kong and Shenzhen with Cashflow in Asia between U.S. receiving money for both wholesale B2B as well as online retail, e-commerce, B2C. So we'll just jump right in, guys, and enjoy. And the show notes, as always, are on the episode number. So it's globalfromasia.com/episode 21. Let's tune in. We have with us special guest and friend of mine, Attila. And we've been on a road trip for the last 3 weeks, almost a month now. And I've known him many years. And finally, I convinced him to share with us his experiences on our podcast today. Thanks for being here today, Attila.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me.
I know you have a lot of various experiences and backgrounds in various ventures. It might be hard to do this in a quick intro, but if you want to just highlight some of your experiences for the listeners.
Sure. I started out in retail, moved to Hong Kong in 2004. Shortly after, moved to China to cut out the middlemen. Shortly after China, I splitted ways with a person I was working with. He wanted to do business the American way, and, well, you just can't do that in China. Shortly after doing my own thing, I moved into wholesale. Wholesale was pretty competitive, and shortly after that, moved into manufacturing, made my own designs, molds, and branding. Had my ups and downs, but mostly was pretty good. Good experiences either way.
I know you have most of your experience, I know you use consumer electronics. What kind of product or which kind of categories were they mostly?
They varied from video game accessories to mobile accessories, from housings to backup batteries.
All right, cool. So a lot of listeners are always talking about, the financial flow of money, how to get money in and out. I think you mostly operated with a Hong Kong bank account, like HSBC. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. The troubles is when you're a small company, you don't really have the cash flow. So you're always moving money around, shuffling it around, making sure that you have enough to purchase products, pay for shipping, pay your employees, pay the rent. Of course, the rent. That's the last thing on your mind. But, I mean, the best you can have is if you have enough money, then you don't really have to worry about shuffling that money left and right, and everything will be smooth after.
Cool. So then receiving money from customers, I know you've both done B2C, like e-commerce, and also some B2B, as you said, wholesale. Maybe for listeners, you could explain maybe the different companies or setups you had for receiving B2B and B2C funds.
Well, receiving payments from B2B, we would strictly do bank transfers. Smaller orders would be through credit card, depending on which country they're from or which currency. If they're paying in US dollar, we would have that money go through a US bank account. If there was any other currency or any other location, they would be going through a merchant account through Worldpay, which would disperse the payments into our Hong Kong company account every 2 to 3 weeks. They are slightly more expensive. They do require upfront fees, unlike many US merchant companies, but it's definitely worth it. And about the B2C, we would mostly accept Worldpay for that. It was just simpler rather than transferring money from US so back to Hong Kong and worrying about the tax paperwork and so forth.
Cool. One question a lot of people have, and actually I even have, is PayPal in Hong Kong. I even have this problem, is I receive US dollars, and then if I want to withdraw to a Hong Kong bank, wouldn't I have to convert that to Hong Kong dollars?
The problem now is if you have a Hong Kong PayPal account, it automatically converts to Hong Kong dollars no matter what. So it's based off of their currency exchange rates, which is pretty terrible. If you have a US PayPal account, it will remain as US dollar. But if you transfer it to your PayPal Hong Kong account, it will automatically convert either way. So you're taking a big loss there.
Yeah, I guess that's the problem. So obviously I think a lot of people try to avoid PayPal in Hong Kong. Or what I do is I just kind of treat it like a piggy bank. I just use it to buy stuff, like buy things online with the PayPal. All right, cool. And then the corporate structure. I know you're like a wizard here, and I don't know how much you're willing or want to share with everybody. but maybe you can give some examples of some structures that you've done or advised.
Well, it really depends on your country of citizenship. Many Americans are restricted because the government in the U.S. follows you no matter where you go in the world. Certain other countries like Canada, or actually I should say 99% of their countries, they don't follow you like the U.S. So you're not really restricted to those matters. As in terms of corporate structure, I would recommend opening a Hong Kong account, or even various countries that are considered offshore, Caymans or BVI or even Jersey. Some even choose Singapore and Malaysia. You open up a company there and do the banking in Hong Kong, which is beneficial if you don't have actual operations there. You don't have to pay any taxes.
We talked earlier about in other episodes about having an offshore Hong Kong company. So a lot of people wonder about the benefits of a Hong Kong bank. You don't need to have a Hong Kong company to have a Hong Kong bank, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, so some things people forget or don't understand is, you could open an offshore company and then still get the benefits of a Hong Kong HSBC account for the online banking. And
it doesn't need to be per se HSBC. There's hundreds of banks in Hong Kong, but HSBC is the most favorable, as they have opened thousands and thousands, actually I should say tens of thousands accounts that are offshore companies, and they're very easy to work with.
So we've also talked, before this podcast, Malaysia and Singapore as other options, and maybe you could just reiterate that also for me. I'm mostly purely Hong Kong, but you have some experience in Malaysia, Singapore. What's the reasons for that?
It's mostly for the company, the restrictions and laws and so forth. I won't go into detail here, but if you're interested, I can get in touch and talk some more in detail.
We are dealing with kind of sensitive, information here, so I'll try to get Attila to reveal as much as possible publicly. But as he said, some of it maybe you can try to get them offline. So we are talking now about, the logistics or cash flow logistics. So here we've kind of, the previous couple questions was your banking setup, your cash flow with B2B and B2C and the corporate structure. So, I think one of the biggest business, there's two big products, especially e-commerce, is cash flow and your supplier. Hey.
It varies. There's a lot of, because I grew up in America, so I know how to market to Americans. So majority of our sales would come from America. Various times we would switch out the merchant companies from the U.S. merchant back to Worldpay, even if it was the U.S. side, because the flow of money would be too much that our merchant in America would be, hey, what's going on? You're not an American company and you're just, a small LLC and yada, yada, yada. And it's less complicated this way.
Okay. I know we've had some feedback from podcast listeners that they like to hear real numbers. Do you feel like sharing some revenue numbers where you would kind of get these calls or flags, or that'd be making it more interesting if you're willing to share?
It varies. Usually the $10,000 marker or over, it sends a notice, and they start reviewing things over that amount. So we try to keep it under the $10,000 so that they don't raise any flags and no questions get asked.
$10,000 per day, month? Transaction.
Per batch.
Per batch, yeah. I mean, I usually had daily batch when I've processed. Usually I used to have automatic batching.
Yeah.
So
it depends on when you mark the orders as shipped.
Got it. Okay. So, yeah, I guess maybe then rule of thumb is $10,000 per batch. I mean, of course, banks and merchant accounts, they have to watch out for fraud because they're taking liability. If a merchant runs away, especially an offshore company, and then the merchant...
Well, technically, it's not really about the offshore. It's about because you're a new company. In their eyes, you may only be a 1 or 2 year old company or even a 5-year-old company. And they don't really have a stronghold history of like where you're from or, your history or your ethics or your morality. So they will always have a cautious foresight in if you're processing large amount of numbers.
Okay. I'm a little bit unclear, so I think maybe listeners are also unclear. So you have merchant account based in the U.S. as well as the Worldpay merchant and in the same shopping cart?
Yep.
So if it was a U.S. address, it would be a U.S. merchant account. If it was out of U.S. address, it would be a Worldpay?
Pretty much. The basic setup.
Okay, cool. And that's for processing rate, because I know U.S. merchant accounts are much lower than, that's still, we've had Asia Pay on a previous podcast with us, and the rates are definitely higher than like a U.S.
The U.S. merchant companies will charge between 2.3 to 3.2%, depending on which kind of credit card was being used and so forth. Worldpay would just charge a flat 6.3 something for 39%.
Yeah, plus I think they have a setup fee, pretty high setup fee on WorldPay. Marshall's on one of our earlier podcasts, and he has WorldPay too. And I think they even have monthly minimums or monthly fees. WorldPay definitely costs more.
Well, I kind of have a history with WorldPay, so they kind of know me there.
Yeah, you definitely get to know your people you do business with. Till you're definitely a fun guy to work with. So actually, I've been hearing more and more stories, especially on our road trip here. So I think we want to get some case studies. So because you're doing consumer electronics in Shenzhen, China, you also had to buy like components from outside of China. And
yes, we were buying integrated components from USA. The factory would be making them in Thailand, shipping them to Hong Kong. When you're importing into Hong Kong, you have free duty. They don't charge you whatsoever. But importing them into China, that was a flat 16%. And it varies the invoice you give them and their perceived value of the market value. So, I mean, many times they'll believe you on the invoice that you give them. However, if they have any questions or if they doubt that the invoice is fake, they will seek the retail value or the market value and charge you accordingly. As to what we were doing, we were finding unique ways to bring them in to kind of avoid this import tax.
yeah, so I think there's a few points in this conversation. I think a lot of people I talk to that are new to doing business in China think that everything is made in China, and actually it's not really totally true. I think a lot of things are definitely assembled in China, but I think a lot of the more high-tech components inside, like IC or integrated circuits and other, I think sometimes the screens, a lot of screens for mobile phones come from like Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. So these are kind of also the brains of like electronic, and they're a lot of the bigger cost, I think. I'm not actually in this industry so much, but because they're a higher cost, and then there's China has a pretty high import tax or duty, so that actually adds up into the cost, and a lot of people.
Before we continue on that subject, on adding on to the costs, China has a import-export policy so that if you're importing certain products to be manufactured or assembled and being exported, you show the paperwork and you get refunded those import fees.
Yeah, it's pretty complicated, but America doesn't have this, but I think Europe has it, and in China it's called VAT or VAT or value added tax. In China they also call it fapiao. Basically things are taxed from the very beginning of the supply chain and then rebate if they are not sold in China, the end customer, whereas in America it's sales tax that's added on when you buy something at the store. They add a 6 or 8 or 10%, but in China everything is the tax baked in from the beginning. So anything that comes into China or is produced in China has this like 16% flat tax, I believe, and then if it's some goods have a even higher tax on top.
Now the 16%, that's just an import tax. After that, you still have a sales tax or an income tax in terms of the company. And when you mentioned fapiao, it brought back a memory when I'd go through the electronic market. There would be literally hundreds of people outside the subways yelling fapiao, fapiao, fapiao all day. And all they're doing is selling fake invoices so that people can avoid paying tax. Companies can avoid paying taxes.
Yep. And so kind of going back a little bit to actually just earlier today, we're actually recording this in Dallas, Texas on our road trip. And we met a new friend that was actually listening to a podcast earlier that I was on with Terry Lin. And he was asking me about the, electronics in China, being cheaper, like brand name, like iPhones and Samsungs and stuff like that. But actually, usually the goods inside China cost more if they're a real authentic product because they have this 16% or even higher like import duty. So like Attila was just mentioning, when something's exported from China, there's a rebate. So the reason things are cheaper outside of China for like these kind of electronics that are even made in China is because when they export it, they get the tax back. So that's how the price can be lower than even inside of China itself. So I know that's a whole podcast in itself. This whole, fapiao, VAT, rebates, it's pretty deep, so I don't want to bore you guys to death. But I think I don't know how much he wants to dig into this case study, but yeah, I mean, he was bringing in these components from Hong Kong And anybody that's kind of gone through Shenzhen, Hong Kong border, I think there's about 7 different borders, but the main ones are Lohu and Huanggang and Futian or Lohu. They're kind of like walking borders. So you can imagine Attila and maybe some of his colleagues bringing these expensive chips.
We were bringing so many chips in that we would hire private cars and ride over like the VIPs. We thought that we were untouchable. That, we would come over with $1 million car and, they won't search the trunk of our car. But one time they did. We roughly $120,000 worth of products with us. We had a luggage in the back and a luggage in the front. They found the luggage in the back. They did not see the luggage in the middle, fortunately. That's when all hell broke loose. I figured, okay, I have a pocket full of cash. I'll just use my Chinese and talk my way out of it and maybe fill the customs agent's pockets full of cash. But no, it did not work that way. I had paperwork, and next thing I knew, I was trying to find my way out of this.
I could only imagine. I mean, I think another thing, a lot of people kind of underestimate China's like legal structure and think that maybe they can just kind of get away with anything. But
now there is ways to get away with it, but you have to look at the reality that large places with cameras and lots of employees and bosses and among bosses, chances are you're not going to get away. But if you get pulled over in the middle of nowhere and, give him your license with maybe 100 renminbi or 15 or 16 US dollars inside, chances are he'll say, have a nice day.
The problem is probably once you start, you don't know who to, take care of and who not to, and then it probably keeps more and more people probably get involved. And so do you want to kind of give us the outcome of this story or?
Sure. After weeks and weeks of searching, we eventually found a lawyer company. They're a very large lawyer firm. He gave us his word that everything will be fine and this is how much it'll cost. And we told him, well, we've met several people and they seem very dishonest. And he ended up giving us a contract that stated what he was going to do for us, a printed contract with his firm name, his name, and guaranteeing our dismissal of the case and the return of the products. So we signed the papers. The papers were never to see the public, otherwise we would all go to jail. And it was very stressful times, but we paid roughly $32,000 US dollars, and it was very intense moments because my business partner at the same time was in the US and he thought everything was being doctored, fake, and that I was just wanting to pocket extra money in my pocket, which unfortunately put a huge tension in our partnership, which eventually ended up us separating months later.
Kind of leads right into my next question. As you said in your introduction, you had a falling out or so, I don't remember exact words, but it's some falling out with your partner. And I think we all know, or especially if there's any new entrepreneurs or new businesswomen listening, I think business partners is one of the hardest things. I have my wife actually next to me here, and I think business partner might almost be, or is almost equal to a wife or a husband in a marriage. But maybe you can explain the story of how this went.
So this business partner of mine, we've been friends for over 8 years, and we didn't have any contract set in place. We've known each other so long and been through so much that I've looked up to him like a mentor, like a bigger brother. I don't have any brothers, so that meant a lot to me. You can say I was naive at the time, but the reality is that I just believed everything he said.
I made that mistake too in my first business. I didn't have contracts with my partners either, and they were my good friends. And look, you met them on our road trip. Some of them, Andrew was one of my main business partners in my first business, and luckily, we are still friends, and it was a little bit awkward for a while when we got out of that business. But yeah, I think it would have been much easier with a clear contract and agreement of what happens if, and what happens if that. But I think a second complexity is, sometimes our business partners, like, I'm not going to get my business involved too much, but, for even Andrew, for example, didn't understand China. And when we were doing business with China and he was buying products from my supplier or suppliers that I was helping with, I don't want to say Americans specifically, but Westerners don't understand, China or Asian culture is very different. So that's also an added complexity when you're overseas and the time zone differences and the communication and culture and everything. So, but yeah, it sounds so obvious, but I'm sure there's lots and lots of listeners that have partnerships right now that don't have proper contracts. And I think even if you already have a business going, I think one good thing is after this list, try to write something down on paper. It doesn't have to be like for really legal as much it is as to avoid arguments later. Just to write something down that how do you get out of this business if you want to, or what's the rule?
And aside from writing contracts, make sure you consult with an attorney. Even if you don't have him write the contract, you can consult with one and find out what should be written in the contracts. Like Mike said, how to get out of a business, or what happens if the business dissolves, or what happens if one wants to push another one out. And unfortunately, that's what happened with me. My business partner felt that he couldn't trust me anymore, and he wanted to push me out. Everything was set up. Everything was to the point where he didn't need me anymore. The trust was lost, and we didn't have any paperwork. So he dictated, because he was a 60% senior partner, I was a 40%, while I was making 60% because I was doing majority of the work, and he was making 40% of the financials. And it left into a very complex relationship towards the end. We've not only lost our friendship, but also the business that we've both worked hard on.
Yeah, I think a lot of businesses fail mostly because not because of business itself, but the partnership or relationships inside of the company. So
partnerships are like a relationship. You need to have the trust factor. You both need to be honest, you both need to be loyal, and you both need to communicate. And when one stops working at it, it falls apart.
Okay. So it's been, I think, a great episode and a little bit over our normal time allotment, but I think we can wrap this up with the last question of, a tip for listeners, maybe around, I have consumer electronics on my list here of questions, but also just kind of doing business in Asia or Hong Kong is also another question. But somebody that wants to kind of get involved in, trading electronics in like South China and Hong Kong, or just business in Asia generally, what would you kind of like advise them today in 2014 now?
I would advise them to learn how to design a product and make it, because there's so many products out there being sold by so many people, and if you have a unique product, no one can negotiate with you. You can dictate the price, you can dictate the terms, and if they want the product, then they pay the price that you set.
Yeah, and I think, I think Attila talks a lot of them. I talked to a lot of them. There's people that want to be like a super electronic store online, selling every tablet and phone. I wish them well if they want to do that, but I think
my advice on that is don't try to sell every product in the book. Find a few good products and market it well.
Yeah, especially, I don't want to say late to the game, but, I think to do that now is...
You're never late to the game.
Never late to the game, but to be a general supplier of all these electronics, it's mostly a quality control company, I think, because controlling your supply chain and the quality of your product is one of the hardest things. So I think that's one reason, at least I would say, and I think Attila is your knowing your product and making sure you have a superior product is the key. And then, like you said earlier, if some private questions, people want to reach out to you, we'll put this in the show notes too, on the episode. If you want to let our listeners listen, what would you like them to reach out on Twitter or email, or how would you like to talk to them?
I would prefer you don't contact me at all. You can reach me at Attila at Attila.com. That is ATTILA at ATTILA.com.
All right. So thanks, guys, for listening, and thank you, Attila, so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate you taking the time out. And until next time, we might get you back on the show. No, one topic maybe is manufacturing in China and the consumer electronics. That was a pretty cool episode, so maybe we'll get you on there for that. So thanks, guys, for listening.
For having me, Mike.
All right.
Have a good night, everyone.
Have a good night or a good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for listening, guys. Bye-bye. All right, and that's a wrap. Our conclusions will be a little bit shorter today because we had a little bit longer than usual episode, and I believe it was very valuable for me, and I hope everybody else. So next week, we should have Attila on for a second episode, talk about his manufacturing of consumer electronics in China and dealing with that between cross borders. So I'm definitely excited to do that one. So tune in next week. Cheers.
To get more info about running an international business via Hong Kong, please visit our website at www.globalfromasia.com. That's www.globalfromasia.com. Also, be sure to subscribe to our iTunes feed. Thanks for tuning in.